Alabama Annie with part 8 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. Luncheon with the Hats. On a Thursday morning in August, my aunt dressed me up in a silly little pink ruffly thing all down the skirt in front of it, with matching socks and my black patent leather shoes, and just before lunchtime, we held hands and walked across to the big hotel. Mr. John had said when he saw me that I looked a lot like Shirley Temple with my hair all curled up in that bow, and Aunt Mary wore a bright red dress that was so tight her bottom wiggled back and forth when she walked in those high-heel shoes. She had a black hat on her head with an explosion of little bluebirds and butterflies. As we climbed the steps to the old hotel, the men watched us go inside. One of them whistled at her. A man had whistled at Mama once when we were walking home from church, and she'd hit him with her umbrella. But Aunt Mary didn't seem to mind the attention at all. In the beautiful lobby of the hotel, Mr. Harry met us, and we followed him through the double doors into the dining room, and there at a table were two more women who were overdressed, just like Aunt Mary. They stood as we entered the room, and one of them, Myra Olstein, rushed over, bending down and kissing me smack on the lips, the brim of her big outlandish purple hat brushing against my hair, my face shoved into her bazongas that reeked of perfume, and before I could catch my breath, Patsy Lee Hasgood swooped in like a giant canary and whirled me around, dressed all in yellow as she was, and pinched my cheeks. I wriggled free of her and backed away from them all as Aunt Mary introduced me to them, and we sat down at a table. Myra reached across the table and patted my hand. "Oh, Maggie, we'll have so much fun this summer," she exclaimed, as they poured themselves some wine from a bottle on the table and lit their cigarettes as Harry came into the room with a big glass of lemonade and a slice of his delicious chocolate cake for me. And I sat listening to them chatter away like birds about this or that, giggling and laughing like schoolgirls as their bracelets jingled when they moved their arms. It was quite the scene, and it seemed everyone in the room was watching them. At first, everything seemed to be a lot of fun when I was with the Hats, but over time, I would realize three of them had a much darker side. Our guest at the tavern. Since I had arrived in Starlight, I had met a lot of interesting people who were always dropping by to visit. There was, of course, William Post, the son of old George Post, a man I'd heard stories about, the man who had sold this land to John Mason. His son William was now a very old veteran who walked with a limp and used a cane and sometimes stayed with us in the small bedroom across from the office at the end of the downstairs hall. But he lived in the old cabin his father had built at the edge of the forest behind the tavern and the barn. William seemed to have a habit of arriving just in time for a good meal. He had recently returned to Starlight from a visit with one of his old war buddies who lived in Georgia. His clothes were old-fashioned and threadbare, and Hattie sometimes took pity on him and sewed on a missing button, scrubbed his yellowed shirts, or patched a torn elbow on a coat. He kept candy in his pockets, but he never offered me any of it, and he always smelled like menthol and snuff, and a bit like the goats that lived in his yard. The first time I met him, he'd said he'd tell me a story, and I sat down with him on the back porch of the kitchen to listen. But it turned out William had a short-term memory from his war injuries, and every time he said he'd tell me a story, it would always be the same one. At first, it was interesting, but it became very boring after a while. When I complained to Miss Hattie about his storytelling, she told me to be nice and listen anyway. But after he'd told me that same story about 30 times, he'd catch me rolling my eyes at him because I could repeat it word for word. He had his favorite chair in the parlor, an old wingback that sat just to the left of the fireplace, and no matter who was there visiting or who was sitting in that chair, he'd always ask them to move, pointing that old cane of his at them. There was a small table beside that chair, and he'd always sit his drink and pipe there. Most times he'd fall asleep, but Hattie finally had Mr. John to remove the chair from the parlor after she discovered that old George had been peeing on it. She said it reeked of him, and that made William mad when he discovered his favorite chair was gone. But Mr. John found him an old wooden rocking chair in the barn and fixed it up nice. He brought it in and put it where the old chair had been, and William was just as happy as ever in no time. Sometimes the Reverend Martin from the church next door would come for coffee, but his wife Louise rarely, if ever, left their house except for church and shopping. I suppose when the Reverend did take those two boys of theirs out, she was glad for some peace and quiet and could get a moment to herself. Those boys were a handful. He and his wife lived in the parsonage behind the church with the boys, who were both as red-headed as roosters and covered in freckles from head to toe. They were as mean as snakes, those two. Hattie hated it when he brought them along with him to the tavern, because they could tear a room to shreds in no time. When they were there, it was always my job to watch them, and if I could get away with it, I'd keep Rodney and Randy cornered in the hallway past the parlor with all of the doors to the rooms closed. There was nothing in the hall that they could break or hurt with those doors closed. So all they could do was run back and forth or play with their cars or fight each other. That's what they did most of the time. A lot of the guests who stayed at the tavern were just normal people. There would be couples and families with children that I could play with sometimes, but some of our guests were a little odd. Once I'd met two Italian nuns traveling from Coleman, Alabama to Rome, Georgia, dressed in their black and white habits. Their names were Sister Catherine and Sister Mary Rosa. Sister Mary Rosa didn't speak English very well, so it was hard to understand her, but she would chatter away in her native Italian just the same, and Sister Catherine was also a talker too. She talked all the time, in fact. Hattie said maybe she should take a vow of silence at the retreat they were about to attend when they got to Rome. But when they stopped again on their return trip to Coleman, nothing had changed, except Sister Mary Rosa had learned a little more English. There were also traveling musicians from New Orleans and Memphis who occasionally came through Starlight on their way here or there. And since the tavern allowed colored folk as well, they always stayed with us. One of them was a very large woman who sang opera. Mariah Smith gave me an autographed photo and even sang for us in the parlor one night. Her voice rattled the china in the dining room, and for days after she left, I drove everyone crazy trying to sing like her. And once, a piano player named Albert Amos from New Orleans and his upright bass player, along with three other men who played trombone, trumpet, and clarinet, were traveling through to the Carolinas. And they gave Starlight an impromptu concert on the front porch of the tavern one night. Miss Hattie went all out to cook for them and had Uncle John and Mr. Harvey roll our big old upright piano across the parlor floor and out the front door to the porch. And half the guests from the hotel and several other locals arrived, spreading quilts on the lawn and settling in to listen. Some people hung out the dining room windows to listen to the music, and the hats were in rare form that night, dressed up and dancing. That summer, I met a photographer by the name of Malcolm Strange, who had come to take pictures of Lookout Mountain for a magazine. It was called the National Geographic. Aunt Mary had some of those in her office. on the bookshelves that I like to look at, and Mr. Strange had asked if Mr. Harvey and John would drive him around the mountain while he was visiting to take his pictures. They took him to see Little River Canyon and the Welsh Caves above DeSoto Falls, and later in my life I would have a great fascination for all of those places and the mysterious legends surrounding them. They also took him to see Fort Mountain, Georgia, and photograph another stone wall like the one at DeSoto Falls as well, because it was believed to have been constructed by Prince Madoc of Wales, long before DeSoto had ever arrived on this continent. I wondered why he'd want to take pictures of any old wall, but he seemed very excited by the prospect. For several evenings, he also interviewed William Post about his father and his childhood days as the son of an Indian agent during the infamous Trail of Tears, and I finally heard William tell some different stories. Then one evening, Aldous Wells arrived over from his house. He stepped through the parlor door, and when I saw him, he smiled and gave me a wink. He called me over to him and handed me a book from his personal library. It was called Tom Sawyer. Malcolm Strange spent days with Aldous Wells, riding horseback across the countryside to remote locations that could not be reached by automobile. Fascinated by this man, and several of the photographs he took of Aldous were featured in a long story about the mountain. Years later, Malcolm Strange would return, lured by some legend of an ancient treasure, after he was deceived by a thief. Sometimes there would be hunters or fishermen who came to stay with us at the tavern, telling tales around the fires at night about their adventures, about stalking deer or bear or the fish they caught, and there would be a few families every now and then who showed up down on their luck, some of them in wagons and some limping along in beat-up old automobiles that barely ran. We always offered to let them pitch a tent behind the barn at the tavern, and Miss Hattie always saw to it that no one went hungry. Sometimes she might ask the women in the group to help with the laundry, or Uncle John would put the men and the boys to work around the place making a repair. Once, the first summer I was there, a traveling revival arrived on the mountain. The preacher pitched his tent for services in the field behind the church, singing songs and shouting until late in the night, and all those gossiping harpies and the other folks, of course, came to see what that was about. Saturday morning, I saw that preacher down at the service station drinking moonshine out of a ball jar in front of God and everybody after preaching about the evils of alcohol, and it turned out he had also fathered a child with a little gal that came to the revival to be healed. Now, from June until mid-August each year, the population of Starlight fairly doubled as hundreds of children and their families arrived to attend the summer camps hidden away along the banks beneath the trees on the mountain. They would arrive with their parents in fine automobiles or come by train from faraway cities, and some of them would stay at the hotel or the tavern, taking rooms also in private homes, and some even pitched tents on the tavern grounds. These wealthy families and their children were from Atlanta, Huntsville, Memphis, or New Orleans, and they all had unusual names like William Jeffrey III or Margaret Mary Wilbury. I couldn't stand some of them. They were snobby and snooty and even turned up their noses at Hattie's best cooking. And some of them treated her like she was just the help and nothing more. Aunt Mary had to bite her tongue when those people were around. During those times, Hattie kept the kitchen busy when all those folks were visiting, not wanting to socialize or say too much to anyone or say something she might regret later. And I made numerous trips up and down the stairs because of all the towels they used. And goodness heavens, the messes they left behind. Hattie said words never could express how difficult it had been to clean up after them, scraping up sticky chewing gum or cleaning up spilled sodas and cookie crumbs from the floors. It would take us a good 2 days just to set everything back in order again after they were gone.